Okay, lovely. Here we are again then, folks. Same time, same place. Very much so, really. So, feet about hip width apart, weight just slightly forwards, hips dropping back and turning gently. Just allowing yourself to slip into a sort of memory, really, of doing Tai Chi, the familiar routines, particularly the familiar way of starting, very much part of this sort of almost like a meandering journey into a particular quality of movement, a state of mind, however you sort of imagine it, really whatever you get from it. Nice steady rhythm in your movements. And as your thoughts stray away, just gently sort of chivvy them back so that one way or another you're establishing a sort of connection in your mind with different parts of your body. And gradually in these practices, that becomes more formalized in the sense that to start off with, I think it's quite reasonable to think, well, notice whatever there is to be noticed. Because at least then your thoughts are in this area rather than out there somewhere. But to really develop the art, we want to initially recognize the lower part of the body and its role, your feet, your hips, your waist. Think about the distribution of your weight, the alignment of your hips, both downwards towards your ankles in this first position, upwards towards your shoulders. And trying to get to a point where that is just kind of automatic to you. It's not that it doesn't go away, but the the, the use of these as reference points becomes just something that you do quite normally. Then, with a very simple movement like this, it's a good opportunity to start to feel more what's happening in the upper part of your body, which parts of your body are extending out when you turn in one direction, which parts are contracting. How does that change when you change direction? And how does that affect the change of direction? Because one thing we want to do is to maintain a sense of working within these soft boundaries of the movement. And so when I turn in one direction, one side of my body, some parts of my body, not necessarily on one side, are extending outwards. And there'll always be a point where that extension begins to tighten up. And it's really just before we reach that point that we simply allow ourselves to be pulled back. It's like a pendulum swinging, I suppose you could say. A pendulum will swing down and up, and at a certain point it will just stop as gravity takes over. So the idea is to not cause a straining, a stiffening in any part of your body. Sometimes I've used this image of tuning a musical instrument like a guitar or a violin. And that's quite an interesting image because we recognize then that just a slight touch on the strings or even on the body of the instrument will produce a resonance, a vibration. And so that then becomes a way into a very kind of subtle awareness of movement, energy, momentum, whichever label you care to put on it. But there's these little changes, both physically and in terms of the movement through the body. It's all the same movement, So I sometimes think it's a bit like if you've ever taken a drop of water from a pond and put it under a microscope. You go to the pond and you've got this big bit of water, and then you sort of magnify down, 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 and you get a very different view. And yet it's all the same thing, really. So the the awareness that we finally develop has depth, width, and breadth to it, if you like. And with any given exercise and with any given approach to an exercise, depending on just what we're working on at that time, we may choose a particular view. But it isn't necessarily the case that one is more dominant than another or better than another. It's just what is required at the time. And then just raising your arm. It's probably best, initially at least, to have this idea that I've used before, standing on a hill looking out over a valley, because that way you're also open to new opportunities and new things that arise. And then let the hands drop down. Now just gently rolling your weight forwards and backwards in your feet. And with that awareness, again, just becoming very sensitive to the changes in your body and those points at which we can detect the tightening beginning. You don't necessarily have to just stop moving at that point. What you might find is, say, as you go forwards, maybe your calf muscles tighten up, begin to tighten up, and then if you can just soften your hips a bit, sometimes you can release that. So we can begin to just push out these soft boundaries of the movement. It's like blown into a bubble. You'll get a little bit more movement and then you'll go too far and you'll lose it and you'll have to come back and so on and so forth. But over a period of time, that develops and our range of movement within those soft boundaries increases. And then your hands down by your sides. Remember, they follow the movement of your hips and weight. So here, for instance, if I exaggerate, I go from back to front, and my hands are behind, and then they follow through. Remember, this is very exaggerated. It's really quite a small movement. I sink back, and so using the image of being in water, so swaying in the river, helps with that. It also helps with creating the movement. Don't think about, well, how am I going to do this? Try and just convince your body that you really are in water and try and get it to behave in a way that would be natural for it in those circumstances. And then observe how your body's moving. So, for instance, again, I'll exaggerate when I'm forwards. If I'm just standing in air, I can go anywhere really. There's no resistance. But if I tried to do that in water, say in a river, and it was pushing me around, or in the sea, I'd get in a bit of a tangle. The way to do it, it seems, would be to let my hips drop back like that, and then my arms would follow. But sometimes it seems like that. So we build up a sort of memory within body and mind, really, of ways of moving. And we always use the image of water. I say always, very commonly use the image of water in Tai Chi because it helps to really foster two things. One is a softer way of moving, and we sort of recognize instinctively that in water, if we tighten up, if I stiffen up, just it becomes harder to move. We meet more resistance. So we get a sense for this yielding quality that is so characteristic of Tai Chi. And partly through that, and partly through just the sort of different way of moving, more connected way of moving, we begin to realize that there's a real quality of strength that starts to come through. So this yielding quality in Tai Chi is not just a giving way. It's not simply a question of going with the flow. Somebody once said, only dead fishes go with the flow, but more a case of recognizing the flow and how we can work with it to get to where we want to be. And this internal strength is available to all of us. And then this time, as you come forward, trying to let your weight settle just behind the balls of your feet. Again, I'll exaggerate there. You rest there, but now you let your hips drop back so the ankles come above. Sorry, the hips come above the ankles. And then a little bit further down, bring your hands around as though you're cradling the ball. Change from the horizontal to the vertical movement. And all the same sort of factors apply. Won't necessarily feel them all in the same way with all the movements. Some movements, it'll be more obvious to you than others. And that's a very personal thing, I think. But the more you recognize these different elements in Tai Chi, the more you'll find them throughout the whole practice. It may be that certain movements, certain postures highlight areas of your body that feel stiff or tight or blocked. And of course, we can then simply move our attention away from those and wait for the movement to work for us, which in the end it probably will. We might want to analyze what we're doing a little bit. Is there something that you're doing in that particular movement that is incorrect or can be changed to a more positive way, making the movement? Can we use an image? I like the image of the movement within the body like being like water flowing through and around obstructions and gradually wearing them away. We could also think in terms of releasing in those areas, particularly as we sink down, because the sinking down should become something that feels more natural to us and more likely to release tightening and stiffness in the upper part of the body. And it's just almost like a blockage draining away from a drain pipe, gravity being allowed to pull on the air. So say it's the shoulder that you feel tightened, really feeling the pull of gravity, the weight of your arms through that shoulder can also encourage the release. And again, different things work at different times. Now change to the wild goose. If you are concerned at the moment with a particular part of your body, that can be a very useful thing, but don't overdo it. If whatever approach you're taking doesn't bring about a release after a few moments, sometimes it's a good idea just to let your attention switch somewhere else, or to draw back to that sense of being on the hill looking out over the valley. Because if we get too caught up with one particular part of the body, that can actually reverse that feeling of releasing. We get so caught up that, oh god, that short, oh, it's still tight, and it sort of seems to reinforce the tightness. So be patient with these things. And then parting the clouds. Recognize also the benefits for your mind in looking this closely at these familiar movements, the sense of space, quietness, stillness, which is also something that we find increasingly will stay with us. This chivying, this herding of your thoughts very much has that effect. Now change to Dragon Plucks the Stars from the Sky. One more time on each side. And then pushing in 4 directions. Sometimes you might want to pick, say, a couple of parts of the body. This one, as you turn, a hip on one side and the shoulder on the opposite side, and just really observe what is happening between those 2 points as you make the movement. Again, don't do that for too long with any particular part of the body. Take time always to sit back, to look out over the valley. Take time to just check the basics. When you do this, are you still standing with your weight slightly forwards, with your hips dropping back? Have you still got that sense of the root of your center of gravity dropping, the openness in the upper part of your body? Do one more round. And then changing. And then if it's comfortable, add in the turn. Switch sides. And then add in the turn. Excuse me. Now rowing a boat in the middle of the lake. One more time. And then go back to the swaying in the river exercise. See how that feels now. And of course, the very act of going through a routine of movement is itself an act of sort of drawing your thoughts in to this space. And it may feel different. Just come slowly to a halt. Just a word about this idea of using Tai Chi as a kind of art that can help us to promote healing and well-being and so on and so forth. I'm obviously a great believer in the efficacy of Tai Chi and indeed many other so-called complementary techniques. I'm also a great believer in the efficacy of Western medicine. I think they should complement each other. You know, if you're getting a pain in your knee or your back or something like that, and you may find, hopefully, that Tai Chi is kind of helping with that. But if it keeps coming back, then maybe it's time to go and see your GP or something like that. I know that in a way that sounds obvious, but I do sometimes come across attitudes that, well, we don't need to do that because we're doing this or whatever. I think the key word for me here is complementary. That arts like Tai Chi and lots of other things are complementary to the more kind of, if you like, orthodox standard medical techniques. I remember many years ago had one student come into me and had quite a lot of experience of martial arts. He was doing well at the Tai Chi, but he kept getting headaches. And he tried different things. He found, when he did Tai Chi, they eased a bit, but the headache came back. Tried massage, and it's okay, but it came back, and so on and so forth. And finally, he went to the opticians and found out that he needed glasses. So, what was causing his headache was eye strain, frankly. And so, there was a very simple solution there. It's common sense, really, and I probably don't need to tell you, but I always like to make that point on occasion that I'm certainly not advocating turning your back on other more common, more widely available, perhaps healing techniques. I think Tai Chi is great for promoting that self-help, that self-awareness and motivation for your own healing, but it isn't some kind of global panacea. Regrettably, if it was, it would be great, wouldn't it? But it's not. Life's really not that simple. So go back to this sort of seated position. We sometimes call it sitting, and I think that's quite an interesting way of looking at it. The change from this to this is just like you've just kind of perched yourself on a wall or something like that. There can be a great sense of almost relief there, I think, sometimes. Obviously, your legs need to get used to this. Remember, the conditioning of the muscles of your legs is very important. And then transferring your weight from side to side. So these real basic qualities, the rooting down, the weight transfer, the movement from your center, and all that implies in terms of that quietness of the mind and so on and so forth, become part of the background to what we do in Tai Chi. It's not that it never goes away, it's just that we recognize when it goes away. Again, an example I sometimes give to people is the shoes. When we walk along the road, we don't walk along the road looking down at our shoes, say, yep, that one's done up. Still done up, we're okay. You'd never get anywhere, would you? What happens is you're walking along the road and you're maybe chatting to a friend or something like that, and then you suddenly realise your shoes come undone. So you just, hold on, do my shirt, you bend down, do your shoelace up, and you walk on. And you don't have to think about it particularly. It's just something registers that something's not quite right, and you need to do something about it. You want to get to a point where these basic elements are working in that way. So we kind of notice them by their absence sometimes, and it's repetition that will do that for you. If you'd never worn shoes, you probably wouldn't notice. So we're going to go into bear play. So get this little bit of a swing in your hips here. Push up. Again, I'm exaggerating. Go over to one side. Bring the hip around. I've gone way too far. You can see I'm nearly falling over there. So it's more like that. But I want you to see coming up and over. Same thing here. Just get that movement going. It should feel quite strong but soft. Again, as though you're moving in water around hips, buttocks, lower back. very much a sense of dropping down. If it's comfortable for you to get that sense of your weight being just behind the ball of the foot, if it's not straining you to do that, then try and think of that as the kind of target for your weight as it goes into the foot. And then bringing your arms into the movement, the push up through the hip creates an expansion that pushes your arm out, and the hip guides it over, and you sink down. And then you go on the other side. Again, I'm exaggerating a little bit, although this is an exercise where it's quite interesting just to push out a little bit. We don't want to get so caught up with small movements that we forget that we can also make big movements. Again, a sense of balance there. Notice that when my hand goes down, it's straight out from my shoulder and in line with my hip, not over here somewhere. Partly depends on how far you turn, but even if I turn a long way, it's still in line there. It hasn't drawn across the body. So it's like, you're very much moving forwards here, is the image. It's not the bear somehow lurching sideways or something. Again, quite a supple image, but one that carries with it an image of strength, an idea of strength as well. When an animal like a bear, or probably more likely to be able to relate to something like a cat or something like that, when they move, quite often you'll see them moving with the whole body. And one of the sort of more simple lines of instruction, I suppose you'd call it, in the old writings of Tai Chi, simply tells us to move like a cat. And again, that's not always easy to do. Don't get frustrated if you're thinking, "Oh, I've got to feel." Don't feel like you're moving like a cat. It's fine. Just again, use that or another image. Water flowing is another image that you could use. And as you get more experience with the movements, more familiar with that overlap of mind and body, then we find that with the right image, we begin to change how we're moving. It can be quite interesting if you pop out after the class and wander down the road to the shops or to walk the dog or something like that. Every now and then, remind yourself of some of these things. And sometimes when I'm walking down the road, I suddenly think I should be rooting down, and it changes. Or, oh, I can, why am I stumbling along when I should be moving like someone who teaches Tai Chi? And sometimes you just have to remind yourself of that, and it can be quite interesting to observe the changes in your body. This time, settle down into the supporting leg. Deliberately turn out so you draw your hand back and go into hitting the ball in front of the shoulder. These exercises cover a lovely range of movement. There's lots of similarities, but lots of subtle differences as well. So there's nothing wrong with focusing on one exercise. We could spend the entire class just on one exercise, and that can be quite an interesting thing to do. But it's not the only way to practice. So in your own time, particularly, do take time to just don't feel to focus on one exercise or one or two exercises. Don't feel that you have to do the whole set of movements. You could spend 20 minutes just on the first 2 or 3 exercises or something like that. So hitting the ball in front of the shoulder, got a strong upward movement coming from your foot. Springy in your legs. Imagine if you were standing on a trampoline or a bouncy castle doing this. The very act of sinking down would produce a push up. Or indeed in water, because when you sink into water, the water pressure increases and eventually pushes you up. One more and then change to the cow gazes at the moon. One more time. And then circling the ball. And go back the other way. One more time. And shake out. The traditional Chinese term usually applied to those upward outward movements is peng, and it's often described as though the feeling you get if you get a block of wood and you push it down into water, then that push up, the rise and expanding movement. And it's one of the principal sort of energies, one of the principal dynamics in Tai Chi. It would always be in association with its sister movement, which is the movement in the opposite direction, the yielding movement, which is sometimes referred to as Liu. And again, this is not a giving way. It's a very powerful movement and is the necessary prelude to the upward movement. If you don't sink down into the trampoline, it's never going to push you up. And one image for you might be if you fill a sink or a bath with water and then take the plug out. If you put your hand over the plug hole, used to do this as kids. Used to think it was hilarious, and it will sort of suck your hand down. So it can be in itself a very powerful energy, but it's one that goes with the force that is working on your body. So between those two, Liu and Peng, the downward movement with the pull of gravity and the sort of resilience, the springiness of your body and the ground beneath your feet. We have one of the principal dynamics in Tai Chi. So it's constantly there, shall we say, in the background of the movements. Now put one foot forwards. So there's other elements as well, of course. Don't get me wrong, but liu and peng between them. You might draw a parallel between pedaling on a bicycle. Your legs go up and down. Doesn't matter how good the bike is, how good a cyclist you are. If the pedals don't go up and down, you're not going to get anywhere. So we want that in place, and then we can build on the other things. So that's another very subtle element of Tai Chi that you can gather your thoughts around. So when we do this movement, we get to a point where we wait. You settle back, and rather than thinking, right, I better go forwards, you're waiting for the push back. And then you go forwards, you sink down, and again, you're waiting for the return in movement, the push back from the leg, which could take you anywhere, of course, but the intent is very much to change, to go forwards or backwards. And it's quite interesting because after a while, it's as though the conscious, oh, I've got to move now, is no longer needed, and it feels like the push comes from somewhere else. You almost feel as though the ground is pushing you back or something like that. It's hard to say exactly where it comes from, but it comes from somewhere much deeper within the movement. And when we do this exercise, it's very even, of course. You try and make it the same time going forwards and backwards. There's nothing to really interfere with that. But if we get a bit of wind, try going outside and standing in the wind in different directions, sometimes the wind from the side or diagonally or from the front, and see what difference that makes, because that adds another dimension of force or power into the whole exercise. Raising your toes and your heel. And then stepping in. On the other side, think about your stance. Width of your hips is the width of the step, and the length to begin with is about the same, but as you sink down a bit more, maybe a little bit longer. But again, there's a feel to that. You want to be able to feel that you can comfortably get that 60% of your weight into your front leg, comfortably get that 70% of your weight into your back leg. You don't want to feel that you're somehow really straining for that. If you are, make it a slightly shorter stance. And just give your body a chance, give your mind a chance to understand how we make that movement and build on it from there. Try and avoid having your step too short, though. Sometimes people hardly take any step at all, and this can be quite interesting, by the way, but it's quite an advanced level, if you like, because by the time you've registered that you've started movement, it's almost time to stop. So it's very, very subtle, and too short a step becomes a bit addictive, or not addictive, but it kind of breeds that shorter step. We need to be able to step out a little bit in order to be able to continue to step out. So I'm not suggesting that it's wrong to take big strides. It's just it doesn't come into this exercise. And then raising your toes and your heel. And as always, this approach, just slightly shorter than normal stance, slightly wider than normal stance, and so on, offers us a perspective on moving, on stepping, that is very valuable for our overall mobility. And then stepping in, planting the foot, and then taking a couple of steps forwards or backwards if you're comfortable with this. Just change direction if you haven't done so already. Shake out. None of these things that we say about posture, about movement, are fixed. Tai Chi is an art of change. And we change in doing Tai Chi. So, for instance, when I talked about hip width, depending on who you talk to, and there are different styles of Tai Chi, and within those styles, there's a multitude of approaches. So, some people will measure the hip width by the outside of the foot, as I'm doing now. Or unless you see, I'm not terribly comfortable in this because it's not really how I normally do it. But then from the outside of the foot to the hips to the shoulders and so on. Some will do it from the midline of the foot, a little bit wider. Others will do it from the inside of the foot, which is my preference. Um, have a look around next time when you're walking down the road and look at other people. There's a multitude out there of body types. I think in modern physiotherapy, they define. I think it's something like 16 female and 18 male body types, or something like that. Don't quote me on that. I've probably but and that's just looking at kind of generalizations. Even within those body types, there's a tremendous amount of variation. So we start to rely on an intuitive sense of the movement feeling correct for us, rather than this is where the foot should always be. So 1 foot forward, sink your weight back, pigeon spreads its wings. Your posture should allow for that smooth, fluid, strong movement, and should allow for that yielding quality as well as the expanding quality, and should help us to maintain that quality in the mind of a kind of still, quiet space. One more time. Sink back. I still don't have a name for this exercise. Just bring your hands around and forward, circling around. And then fisherman cast the net. And pushing a wave. One more time. Shake out. So on the other side, pigeon spreads its wings. Now change. And change. and then pushing away. One more time. Good. Rubbing your hands together. And tapping over your face. Over your head and neck. Down to one shoulder of your arm. The other side. Onto your back. And around your hips. Your legs. Light on your belly. And the upper part of your chest. And sinking down. And then pushing up. Embrace tiger. Return to the mountain. So this image of the mountain can include all of those really fundamental things, the mind and body, the rooting down, the quietness, the awareness of those forces acting on your body. One more round. And stand. Thank you very much again, everybody. So look after yourselves, and I'll hopefully see you very soon again.
Thanks, Mike.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Take care.
Bye. Jerry, bye.
Cheers, Mike.
Bye. Thanks.
Next time. Hopefully.